The moment the Alpha King's golden eyes found her in the crowded great hall, the bowl of scraps in her hands felt heavier than a crown. She was Nessa, an omega of the kitchens, a woman made of silence and shadows, whose greatest ambition was to go unnoticed. He was Ronan, the wolf lord of the north, a king forged in winter and war, a man who noticed everything and forgave nothing. For months, she had been smuggling food to a wretched beggar at the fortress gate, an act of foolish pity that could get her whipped. But what no one knew, least of all her, was that the beggar's scent had woven itself into the Alpha King's soul from 100 leagues away, a beacon of impossible warmth in a world of ice. If you believe that a single act of kindness can change the destiny of a kingdom, type kindness below, and let me tell you what happened next. To understand how she got there, you must first understand the winter. It had been a brutal one, a winter that gnawed at the bones and stole the breath. The wind howled down from the Dragon's Tooth Mountains, a constant, mournful cry that seeped through the thick stone walls of the mountain hold, Blackwood Crag. Snow piled in drifts as high as a man, burying the lower gates and turning the world into a vast expanse of white and gray. For Nessa, the winter meant chapped hands, the perpetual ache of cold in her joints, and the endless work of the kitchens. She was an omega, the lowest rank in the pack, and her life was a repeating cycle of chopping root vegetables, scrubbing iron pots until her knuckles bled, and hauling buckets of water from the well, the ice cracking under her worn boots. She was a ghost in the fortress, moving through the bustling halls and steaming kitchens with a quietness that made her nearly invisible. It was a skill she had cultivated. To be unseen was to be safe. To be unnoticed was to be left alone. The beggar had appeared with the first heavy snow of the season. He was a wraith of a man, huddled by the lower gate, wrapped in rags that did little to ward off the biting cold. His face was obscured by a tangle of matted hair and a dirty beard, and he never spoke, only held out a trembling, frost-bitten hand. The guards ignored him. The pack members who came and went, wrapped in their thick furs, averted their eyes. He was less than nothing, a piece of refuse the winter had spat out at their door. But Nessa saw him. Perhaps it was because she knew what it was to be hungry, to be cold, to be looked through as if you were made of glass. The first time she'd smuggled him a heel of hard bread, her heart hammering against her ribs. He had taken it with a slow, deliberate nod, his head bowed. It became a ritual. Every night, after the great hall had been served and the fires were banked low, Nessa would scrape the leftovers into a wooden bowl. A bit of stew, a few roasted carrots, whatever could be spared without being missed. She would wrap it in a cloth and slip out into the freezing dark, her breath pluming in the air. The journey to the gate was treacherous. The wind tore at her thin cloak, and the snow was a hungry thing, trying to pull her down. But every night, he was there, a huddled shape against the stone. She would press the warm bowl into his hands, and for a moment, his fingers, rough and calloused, would brush against hers. He never spoke a word, but sometimes he would lift his head just enough for her to see the glint of his eyes in the gloom, and it was enough. She told herself it was madness. Alpha King Ronan was away on the Eastern Front, fighting back the feral clans that threatened their borders. But his law was absolute. Resources were scarce. Waste was a crime, and feeding a nameless beggar could easily be seen as theft from the pack. If she were caught by Valerius, the king's stern second-in-command, the punishment would be swift and public. Still, she could not stop. The silent communion at the gate was the only thing in her life that felt entirely her own. It was a small, secret rebellion against the cold, against the rigid order of the pack, against her own invisibility. In that moment, handing over the bowl, she was not just an Omega. She was a provider, a protector. She was seen. The winter dragged on, a relentless siege. News from the front was sparse, grim tales carried by frost-covered messengers. The king was victorious, but the cost was high. The mood in the hold grew heavy, a mirror of the bruised purple sky. Then, one day, the beggar was gone. Nessa went to the gate with her bowl of scraps, her heart a cold knot of dread. The place where he always sat was empty, marked only by a depression in the snow. She waited, the wind whipping her hair across her face, until the stew grew cold in her hands and her fingers were numb. He did not return. She felt a hollow ache, a sense of loss that was entirely out of proportion. He was a stranger, a nameless face. But his absence left a void. Her small purpose was gone. A week later, the horns blew from the highest watchtower, a triumphant, blaring sound that echoed across the valley. The king was returning. The fortress exploded into a frenzy of activity. Floors were scrubbed, fresh rushes were laid, and the kitchens became a whirlwind of preparation for a victory feast. Nessa was swept up in the chaos, her hands busy but her mind distant, still picturing the empty space by the gate. King Ronan arrived at dusk, a formidable figure at the head of his war-weary soldiers. He rode a massive black warhorse that steamed in the frigid air. He was clad in black leather and dark furs, his face grim and etched with the harsh lines of command and battle. Even from the kitchen doorway where she watched, Nessa could feel the power radiating from him, a palpable force that settled over the entire hold, demanding silence and obedience. His presence filled every space. He was larger than life, a being of myth and legend. His hair was as black as a raven's wing, and his eyes, when he finally dismounted and scanned the assembled pack, were the color of ancient gold, burning with an intensity that seemed to see into a man's very soul. The feast that night was a loud, boisterous affair. The great hall roared with celebration. Warriors drank deeply and recounted tales of the war, their voices rough and jubilant. Nessa and the other kitchen Omegas moved through the throng, refilling goblets and clearing away platters of bones, keeping their heads down and their movements swift. Nessa tried to remain invisible, a shadow at the edge of the firelight, but she could feel his eyes on her. It was a strange, prickling sensation on the back of her neck, a focused attention that was utterly terrifying. She dared not look up, convinced it was her imagination, her guilt making her paranoid. The hall grew quiet when the king rose to speak. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the lingering noise like a knife, deep and resonant, with the gravelly edge of command. He spoke of their victory, of the sacrifices made, of the strength of their pack. His words were sparse, powerful, and final. Then his speech concluded. He did not sit. His gaze, sharp and penetrating, swept across the hall. It passed over warriors and elders, over nobles and their mates. And then it stopped. It stopped on her. Nessa froze, a heavy platter of roasted boar still in her hands. The heat from the meat seemed to vanish, replaced by an icy dread. Every head in the hall turned, following their alpha's line of sight. 100 pairs of eyes fell upon her, and the silence became a crushing weight. She was no longer invisible. She was the center of everything. He began to walk towards her. The crowd parted before him, like the sea before a god. Each step he took on the stone floor was a heavy, deliberate beat, like a war drum counting down her final moments. He moved with a predator's grace, an impossible stillness in his motion that was utterly inhuman. He stopped directly in front of her. He was immense, a mountain of a man who blocked out the firelight and cast her in his shadow. The scent of pine, cold steel, and something wild and animal rolled off him in waves. It was overwhelming, primal, and it made the breath catch in her throat. She forced herself to look up, to meet his eyes. They were molten gold, fierce and unreadable. She saw the lines of exhaustion around them, the faint silver at his temples, the hard set of his jaw. This was a king who carried the weight of 1,000 lives on his shoulders. His voice, when he spoke and was quiet, meant only for her, yet it seemed to echo in the profound silence of the hall. He says, "All winter, my wolf was starving." Nessa's mind went blank with confusion and terror. She didn't understand. Was this a riddle? A condemnation? He reached out, his large, calloused hand moving with unnerving slowness. He did not touch her face, but his fingers brushed against the worn wool of her sleeve. A jolt, like lightning, shot up her arm. It was a shock of heat, of impossible energy, that made her gasp. His golden eyes held hers, and in their depths she saw something shift. The hard mask of the king seemed to crack for an instant, revealing a raw, ancient hunger beneath. It was not the hunger of a man for food, but the profound, soul-deep yearning of a wolf. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a rough whisper that vibrated through her bones. "It was you," he said. The words were not an accusation. They were a statement of fact, a discovery, a revelation that shook the foundations of her world. The warmth, the scent of bread and kindness. It was you. And in that moment, she understood. The beggar, the hollow ache of his absence, the impossible connection. It wasn't the food he had been starving for. It was what she had given with it. Before she could process the words, before she could even form a reply, he straightened up. He turned his head slightly, addressing the stunned hall without taking his eyes off her. His voice rang with the absolute authority of the Alpha King. "She is mine. Take her to my chambers. See that she is bathed and clothed. No one is to touch her. No one is to speak to her." The order was so shocking, so utterly incomprehensible, that for a moment no one moved. An Omega from the kitchens? Claimed by the king? Then Valerius, his face a mask of disbelief, stepped forward and bowed stiffly. Two of the senior shield maidens approached Nessa, their expressions a mixture of awe and confusion. The platter slipped from her nerveless fingers, crashing to the stone floor with a deafening clatter. But she didn't notice. Her world had shrunk to the burning gold of the king's eyes and the impossible truth that had just been laid at her feet. She was escorted from the great hall in a daze. The whispers followed her like the rustling of dry leaves, a storm of speculation and disbelief. She was taken through corridors she had only ever scrubbed, up winding stone staircases that led to the king's private wing in the highest part of the fortress, a place she had never even dared to look at before. The king's chambers were a world away from her own small cot in the crowded Omega dormitories. A massive hearth dominated one wall, a fire roaring within it, casting dancing shadows on tapestries depicting ancient hunts and battles. A huge bed, piled high with furs, stood on a raised dais. The air smelled of beeswax, old leather, and the lingering masculine scent of Ronan himself. The shield maidens were efficient and impersonal. They drew a bath in a large wooden tub, the steam filling the room with the scent of herbs. They stripped away her rough, grease-stained tunic and washed her with a gentleness that was at odds with their stony faces. They washed her hair, untangling the knots with a silver comb. Nessa endured it all with a profound sense of detachment, as if she were watching it happen to someone else. Her body was being tended to, but her mind was still back in the great hall, trapped in the intensity of the king's gaze. They dressed her in a simple, soft chemise of fine linen that felt alien against her skin, used to the scratch of coarse wool. They left her sitting on a bench before the fire, her damp hair unbound and falling over her shoulders. Then, with a final, unreadable look, they departed, closing the heavy oak door behind them with a solid thud. She was alone, alone in the Alpha King's chambers. The silence was more deafening than the noise of the feast had been. The only sound was the crackle and hiss of the fire. She stared into the flames, trying to make sense of what had happened. It was you. The words replayed in her mind, over and over. What did they mean? How could he have known about the beggar? An hour passed, or maybe it was a lifetime. The fire burned low, and the room grew cooler. Nessa wrapped her arms around herself, the fine linen doing little to ward off the chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Finally, the door opened. King Ronan entered, and the room seemed to shrink around him. He had shed his formal armor and furs, and now wore a simple dark tunic and breeches that did little to hide the powerful physique of a warrior. He moved to the hearth without looking at her, stoking the fire back to life with a heavy iron poker. The muscles in his back and shoulders coiled and uncoiled with the movement. When the flames were roaring once more, he turned. His golden eyes found her in the flickering light. The raw intensity was still there, but it was tempered now with something else. A weariness, a vulnerability she would never have believed possible in a man like him. He crossed the room and sat not beside her, but on a heavy wooden chair opposite the bench, putting the fire between them. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his large hands clasped together. "You are afraid," he stated. It wasn't a question. Nessa found her voice, though it was a mere whisper. "I don't understand." Ronan looked into the fire, his profile harsh and noble in the orange glow. "For the last 3 months, while I was on the Eastern Front, I was divided. My body was leading a war, but my wolf, my spirit, was elsewhere. It was a state I have not experienced since I was a boy, first learning to control the change." He paused, choosing his words with care. "My wolf was drawn back here, to the hold. Not to the throne, not to my chambers, to the gate. It was cold and it was starving, not for food, for something else, something it had never known it lacked." He finally looked at her, his gaze so direct it felt like a physical touch. "Every night, a woman would come. She brought food, yes, but she brought warmth, a quiet strength, a compassion that asked for nothing in return. My spirit fed on that kindness, and it kept the man fighting 100 leagues away from freezing his own soul." Nessa stared at him, her heart pounding. The beggar hadn't been him in the flesh. It had been his projection, his spirit, a part of him she had unknowingly nurtured. "I could not see the woman's face," Ronan continued, his voice low and rough, "but I knew her scent, woodsmoke, oats, and something else, something like spring thaw after a long winter. When I rode through the gates today, I smelled it again, on the air, and I followed it to you." He leaned forward slightly. "My wolf knew you before I did, Nessa. It recognized you across a war-torn continent. It knew its mate." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning and destiny. Mate. A word of myth and magic. A bond forged by the moon. Deeper than love. More binding than any oath. It was a fate reserved for alphas. For the powerful. Not for a kitchen omega. "That's impossible," she breathed. I am an omega." "I do not care what you are," he said, the words a low growl of absolute certainty. "I care who you are. You are the woman who fed a starving soul when no one else would even look. You are the anchor that held me in the storm. You are my mate." The finality in his voice left no room for argument. It was not a proposal. It was a declaration of what already was. He had not chosen her. Fate had. And his wolf had simply been the first to understand. Would you have believed him, or would you have run? Tell me in the comments, and if you are not subscribed yet, join this family. Nessa's world tilted on its axis. Everything she knew about her life, about her place in the world, was a lie. She was not just Nessa, the quiet Omega. She was the fated mate of the Alpha King. The thought was so immense, so terrifying that she couldn't fully grasp it. She looked at him, truly looked at the man and not the king. She saw the deep lines of exhaustion carved around his eyes. She saw the tension in his powerful shoulders, the weight he carried. And she remembered the beggar at the gate, the silent, desperate need. It was the same need she saw in his eyes now, hidden beneath layers of command and iron control. "Why?" she whispered. "Why me?" Ronan's expression softened, a subtle shift in the hard planes of his face. "Perhaps because you saw a beggar and not a burden. Perhaps because your heart is stronger than any warrior's shield in my army. My wolf chose. I am only just now catching up." He stood then, a towering presence in the firelight. "You will stay here, in my chambers. You will be safe here. The pack will adjust. They will see you as I see you in time." He walked towards the door leading to an adjoining room. "Rest. No harm will come to you here. I swear it on my name." He left, closing the door softly behind him, leaving her alone with the roaring fire and the earth-shattering revelation. She was his mate, and her life as an invisible ghost was over forever. The next few days were a blur of disorientation. Nessa remained in the king's chambers, a gilded cage of comfort and confusion. Shield maidens brought her meals on silver trays, food richer than any she had ever cooked. They brought her new clothes, tunics of soft wool, dresses of deep green and blue velvet that felt impossibly luxurious. She saw Ronan only in the evenings. He would return from his duties, the weight of his rule heavy on him, and they would share a silent meal by the fire. He did not press her, did not demand anything from her. He simply shared his space, his silence. He would tell her about his day, a dispute over lumber rights, a report from a border patrol, the mending of a feud between two families. He spoke to her as an equal, his voice losing its hard edge of command and becoming something quieter, more thoughtful. He asked her questions, simple things at first. What was her favorite season? Did she prefer the forest or the mountains? He listened to her answers with a focused intensity that made her feel as though her simple words were matters of state. Slowly, tentatively, the terror began to recede, replaced by a fragile curiosity. She started to see the man beneath the crown. She saw the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he was tired, the flicker of dry humor in his eyes, the deep love he held for his pack. A love that manifested as a harsh, protective burden. One evening, he came back later than usual. There was a fresh cut on his cheekbone, and his knuckles were bruised. He said nothing about it, but the air around him crackled with a barely suppressed violence. Nessa found herself moving without thinking. She went to the small chest where the maidens kept linens and salves, dampened a cloth, and approached him where he stood staring into the fire. He went utterly still as she reached up and gently began to clean the cut on his cheek. His skin was hot to the touch, a searing heat that seemed to radiate from his very core. He stood like a statue of granite, his golden eyes fixed on her face, his breathing shallow. "Lord Valerius thinks you are a witch," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He believes you have ensnared me with some omega magic." Nessa's hand faltered. Valerius, the stern, unforgiving beta who had always looked at her with disdain. He spoke his thoughts aloud in the council meeting. Ronan continued, his jaw tight. "He suggested you were a weakness I could not afford." I corrected his thinking. She finished cleaning the cut, her fingers trembling slightly. The violence he had enacted on her behalf was terrifying, but the fierce protectiveness behind it sent a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. "You shouldn't have," she whispered. "It will only make them hate me more." Ronan's hand came up and closed gently over hers, pressing the cloth to his cheek. His touch was electric, a current of pure power that made her knees feel weak. "Let them hate," he growled softly. "Let them fear, but they will respect you. They will respect my choice. You are not a weakness, Nessa. You are the source of a strength I did not know I was missing." His thumb stroked the back of her hand, a surprisingly gentle gesture from such a powerful man. The bond between them, the one he had spoken of, flared to life. It was a tangible thing, a low, thrumming ache deep in her chest, a pull towards him that was as undeniable as gravity. That night, she didn't sleep on the bench by the fire. When she grew tired, he simply lifted her into his arms, as if she weighed nothing, and laid her on the massive bed. He covered her with a heavy fur blanket, and then lay down on top of the covers beside her, a silent, watchful guardian. He did not touch her again, but his presence was a warm, solid wall against the darkness, and for the first time since she was a child, Nessa felt completely and utterly safe. Her old life was fading like a dream. The kitchens, the cold, the invisibility, but the pack's resentment was a real and present danger. She could feel it when she was escorted through the halls, the stairs, the hushed whispers, the open hostility in the eyes of the high-ranking women. They saw her as an upstart, an aberration. Lord Valerius was the focus of that resentment. He was old school, a believer in the rigid hierarchy of the pack. To him, an omega in the king's chambers was an insult to tradition, a stain on their honor. He made his displeasure known through cold looks and thinly veiled insults whenever their paths crossed. Ronan's protection was absolute, but it also served to isolate her further. She was his possession, his treasure, kept locked away in the highest tower. She longed for the crisp air, for the feel of earth under her feet. One afternoon, she asked him, Could I visit the kennels? I used to help with the hounds sometimes." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, followed by a slow smile that transformed his harsh features. The Wolf Lord's mate wishes to see the wolves, of course. He took her himself. The walk across the main courtyard was an ordeal. Every eye was on them. Ronan seemed oblivious, his large hand resting lightly on the small of her back, a clear and possessive gesture that dared anyone to challenge them. His warmth seeped through her tunic, a shield against the cold stares. The kennels were a riot of sound and smell. The great northern hounds, massive, shaggy beasts used for hunting and tracking, threw themselves against their enclosures, barking and whining at the sight of their alpha. But they fell silent as Nessa approached. One of the largest, a grizzled old male named Fen, with a scarred muzzle and intelligent eyes, rested his head against the bars of his run, a low whimper in his throat. "He doesn't like strangers," Ronan warned, his voice low. Nessa paid him no mind. She knelt down, her velvet dress brushing the dusty ground, and met the old hound's gaze. She saw no aggression in him, only pain. She reached a hand slowly through the bars, not to his head, but to his shoulder. She felt a deep, arthritic ache there, a phantom pain that resonated within her own body. Without thinking, she let her own sense of calm flow from her fingertips, a silent wave of empathy and peace. She just wanted to soothe his hurt. The great hound sighed, a gust of warm air, and leaned heavily into her touch, his eyes closing. The other dogs lay down, their restlessness gone, a strange quiet falling over the entire kennel. Ronan stared, his golden eyes wide with shock. "How did you do that?" Nessa pulled her hand back, startled by the intensity of his voice. "Do what?" "His shoulder hurts. I just felt it." He looked from her to the now peaceful hound and back again. A look of dawning comprehension crossed his face, a look of awe. "It is not just compassion," he murmured, as if to himself. "It is a bloodline gift, the line of Livia. It was thought to be lost for centuries." "I don't know what you mean," she said, confused. "The first queens of this pack were not warriors," he explained, his voice filled with reverence. "They were empaths, healers of the spirit. They could soothe the rage of a wolf, calm the hearts of men, and feel the pain of any living creature. They were the soul of the pack, while the alpha was its fist. That power, it flows in your veins, Nessa. That is what my wolf recognized. Not just a mate, a queen." The revelation was even more staggering than the first. A dormant power, a forgotten heritage lived inside her. It was the source of her quiet empathy, the reason she had felt the beggar's plight so keenly. It was a magic she never knew she possessed, but not everyone saw it as a gift. A few days later, Ronan was called away to a distant part of their territory to settle a border dispute. He would be gone for 2 days. He was reluctant to leave her, his wolf warring with his duty. "Stay in the chambers," he commanded, his hands framing her face, his gaze intense. "Valerius is in charge, but he will not dare to harm you. Do not leave this wing," she promised. But the stone walls felt more like a prison than ever. On the second day of his absence, a young shield maiden, one of the few who had shown her a sliver of kindness, came to her, her face pale with distress. "It's Fen," she said, wringing her hands. "The old hound. He is in a bad way. The kennel master says his time has come." Nessa's heart clenched. She remembered the old dog's quiet pain. She couldn't let him die alone and in agony. Ignoring Ronan's command, ignoring the danger, she followed the maiden down to the kennels. The scene was grim. Fen was lying on his side in the dirt, his breathing shallow and ragged. The kennel master and Lord Valerius stood over him. Valerius held a short, sharp blade in his hand. "He is suffering," Valerius said, his voice cold and flat. "It is a mercy to end it." "Wait," Nessa said, her voice clear and steady. The men turned, surprised to see her there. Valerius's eyes narrowed with contempt. "This is no place for you, Omega," he sneered. "Go back to your tower." "His shoulder is dislocated, not broken," Nessa said, walking forward, her gaze fixed on the suffering animal. "I can feel it. You are going to kill him for something that can be fixed." Valerius laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "And what would a kitchen scrap know of healing? He is old. His time is done." He raised the knife. "I said wait!" Nessa's voice rang out with an authority she did not know she possessed. It was not a plea. It was a command. And to her own shock, Valerius paused, his hand hesitating. She knelt beside Fen, ignoring the dirt and the danger. The hound was barely conscious, but his tail gave a faint thump against the ground. She placed one hand on his shoulder, feeling the unnatural angle of the joint, the grinding of bone. She placed her other hand on his great head, stroking him gently. "It's all right, old friend," she whispered. "Be calm now. Just relax." She closed her eyes, shutting out Valerius's sneer and the kennel master's doubt. She focused all her will, all the strange, warm power that was awakening inside her, and pushed it into the hound. She didn't just project calm. She projected strength, a sense of peace dulling his pain with her own energy. Then, taking a deep breath, she braced his body with her knee and gave a sharp, decisive pull on his leg. There was a sickening pop. The hound yelped once, a sharp cry of pain, and then went limp. For a terrible second, Nessa thought she had killed him. Valerius's face twisted into a triumphant sneer. But then Fen groaned. He lifted his head, blinked his eyes, and with a grunt of effort, heaved himself to his feet. He shook himself, tested his leg, and then looked at Nessa and licked her hand. The kennel master stared, his jaw hanging open. Valerius looked at the hound, then at Nessa, his face a mask of utter disbelief and dawning horror. He had been about to kill one of the pack's most beloved animals out of pride and ignorance, and an Omega had proven him wrong. At that exact moment, a great roar echoed across the courtyard. "Valerius!" Ronan was there, standing at the entrance to the kennels, his warhorse lathered from a hard ride. He must have returned early. His face was a thundercloud of fury, his golden eyes blazing with feral light. He had seen the knife in Valerius's hand. He had seen him standing over Nessa. He was off his horse in a flash, moving with inhuman speed. He crossed the kennel in a blur, a predator closing in on its prey. He grabbed Valerius by the throat, lifting the bigger man clear off his feet and slamming him against the stone wall. The sound of the impact cracked through the air. "You dare threaten her?" Ronan's voice was no longer human. It was a guttural snarl, the sound of the wolf unleashed. "You dare raise a hand in her presence?" Valerius choked, his face turning purple, his feet kicking uselessly. The pack, drawn by the commotion, was gathering at the entrance, their faces pale with fear. They were about to witness the unrestrained wrath of their Alpha King. Ronan's claws, long and black, extended from his fingertips, digging into the flesh of Valerius's throat. Blood welled up. dark against the gray stone. He was going to kill him. He was going to rip his throat out in front of everyone. "Ronan, stop!" Nessa's voice cut through his rage. He turned his head, his eyes pure, molten gold, the beast fully in control. But he saw her. She walked towards him, her hand outstretched. She didn't touch him. She didn't need to. She reached for him with her gift, with the power of her bloodline. She did not try to extinguish his rage. That would be like trying to stop the tide. Instead, she wrapped it in a blanket of calm, soothing the sharp edges, whispering to the man inside the wolf. "Justice," she projected, her thoughts a silent call to his soul. "Not vengeance. You are a king." The feral light in his eyes flickered. His breathing, which had been a harsh panting, slowed. The claws receded slightly. He was still furious, a walking storm of power, but the man, the king, was back in control. He loosened his grip, and Valerius slumped to the ground, gasping and clutching his bleeding neck. Ronan turned his back on him, his entire focus on Nessa. He walked to her, his movements still charged with power, and stopped before her. He gently took her hand, the one that Fen had licked, and raised it to his lips, his gaze never leaving hers. He turned to face the assembled pack, his arm going around Nessa's waist, pulling her firmly to his side. His voice boomed across the courtyard, imbued with the full, unshakable power of the Alpha. "This is Nessa of the line of Livia," he declared. "She carries the old blood. She is a healer of spirit and heart. She is my mate. She is your queen." He paused, his golden eyes sweeping over the stunned faces, finally landing on the pathetic, broken form of Valerius. "Anyone who disputes this, anyone who shows her anything less than the absolute loyalty and respect she is owed, will answer to me. Their judgment will not be as merciful as the one Lord Valerius just received." He bent his head and kissed Nessa, a firm, possessive kiss in front of the entire pack. It was not a kiss of passion, but of proclamation, a sealing of her fate and his, a formal claiming that left no room for doubt. The pack stood in stunned silence, and then, slowly, one by one, the warriors, the elders, the shield maidens, they all dropped to one knee. A wave of deference, of acceptance, rippled through the crowd. They were not just bowing to their king, they were bowing to their queen. Nessa stood beside him, sheltered in his strength, and looked out at the sea of bowed heads. The woman who had been a ghost in this fortress was gone. In her place stood a queen, her dormant power finally awakened, her worth finally seen, not just by her king, but by herself. A few moons passed. The story of what happened in the kennels spread through the pack like wildfire, cementing Nessa's status. The whispers of the Omega upstart died away, replaced by murmurs of awe about the lost queen returned. Valerius, stripped of his rank, was sent to a remote northern outpost, his pride broken. Nessa found her place not on a throne, but among the people. She had a small garden planted in the sunniest part of the courtyard, where she grew healing herbs. The pack members, once so hostile, now came to her with their troubles, not just physical ailments, but anxieties, feuds, and grief. She would sit with them, listen, and offer the quiet, calming strength that was her gift. She healed the pack's soul, just as she had healed its king. Ronan watched her, his love and pride a tangible presence. He had known she was his mate, but he had not understood the depth of the gift the fates had given him. She was more than his match. She was his balance. She was the compassion that tempered his strength, the calm that soothed his wolf. One evening, they stood on the high battlements of the fortress, looking out as the sun set behind the Dragon's Tooth Mountains, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of orange and purple. The winter had finally broken, and the first hints of spring were in the air. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked, his voice a low rumble beside her. "The quiet? The invisibility?" Nessa leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him. She thought of the kitchens, of the shadows she used to cling to. It felt like a lifetime ago, a story about someone else. "I was never invisible," she said softly. "I was just waiting. I think my soul was cold, too, waiting for someone to see it." He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her arms. The setting sun caught in his eyes, turning them to liquid gold. The fierce warrior, the hard king, was gone. In his place was just Ronan, her Ronan. "My wolf knew," he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "From the very first night you brought that bowl to the gate, he knew he was home." She smiled, a true, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "And it only took you the rest of the winter to catch up." He chuckled, a deep, warm sound, and kissed her. It was a slow, lingering kiss filled with all the silent conversations they'd ever had, a promise of all the springs to come. The cold was finally over. For more stories where quiet compassion conquers the burdens of war, and where being overlooked becomes the source of ultimate power, subscribe to His Wolf Knew first. So tell me, would you have stayed? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.